I've got something really cool for you today. This is the NVX XAD11 monoblock amplifier. My friends over at NVX sent this out for me to test. So we're gonna hook it up to my DIY resistor bank and the SMD AMM1 and see how much power it puts out. Now NVX is doing us a solid here and they have hooked us up with a discount code. If you head over to nvx.com and use the code DIYaudio15, you can get a discount on their website. In addition to the resistive loads that you typically see in an amp dyno, I always like to up the game a little bit and do what's called a reactive load, where you measure the power on an actual subwoofer, so make sure you stay tuned for that. And of course, to do that, we've got to unbox the amplifier. So let's crack it open and see what's in it. All the usual suspects are here. Here is the owner's manual. I'm going to set that aside, talk about that a little bit later. There is, of course, a bass knob. It's so nice when an amp comes with a bass knob. I don't understand why everyone doesn't just ship a bass knob with their amplifier. And here is the amp itself. It has a really small footprint. It looks to be about 4.5 by 8 3/4 inches. One thing to note about this amp is it is kind of thick. It's 2.5 inches tall. With the exception of the power terminals, it accepts 4-gauge power and ground wire. All of the controls and connections are on this one side of the amplifier. This amp has everything you would expect: gain, boost, a crossover, and a subsonic filter. Some people call that an infrasonic filter. That's actually the correct name for it. I'll show you how to set up an infrasonic filter after we get finished testing out the amp. Now, there are two things on this amplifier that are really important to point out. The first thing is that it does have a clip light. More and more amplifiers are coming with clip lights these days. I'm of the opinion that every manufacturer should put a clip light on their amp, and you should really only buy amps that have a clip light. So any amp with a clip light gets bonus points from me. The other thing that's important is this pair of RCA connections over here. And it is not a right and a left channel. It is a mono input and a mono output. So you can run an RCA in and then run an RCA out to another amplifier. So to connect the RCA, you've either got to connect a single channel of the RCA or maybe use something like one of these pigtails right here to go from 2 channels right and left down to 1 channel mono. Now, you may have noticed that there is no onboard fuse on this amplifier, so it is very important that you add an external fuse. And because of that, we need to take a little detour and talk about 3 things you've got to keep in mind when you're fusing your amplifier. The first and most important rule is that you need a fuse near the battery. That fuse is there to protect your car. That keeps your car from burning down if that big, long 17-foot power wire running from the battery to the trunk happens to short out. Number 2, every time you reduce the wire size, you need to add a fuse. So a 4-gauge wire might be able to carry 120 amps of current, so you can use a 120 amp fuse up next to the battery. But if you reduce that down to a pair of 8-gauge wires, you need a fuse on both of those 8-gauge wires that's sized to protect an 8-gauge wire. And the third rule is that no matter what size fuse you use, that fuse needs to be big enough to carry the current that your amplifier is going to draw. Typically, you find that information in the manual, but sometimes it's not there and sometimes it's buried and hard to find. So an alternative is to use the power rating as a tool for calculating the fuse rating. And what you simply do, the shortcut, the rule of thumb, is to take the power rating and divide it by 10. So this one right here is rated for 700 watts into a 1 ohm load. 700 divided by 10 is 70, so we need 70 amps of current in order to hit that power rating. I've never seen a 70 amp fuse, so we're gonna go with an 80 amp fuse. So now let's hook this thing up and see what it can do. We're going to start with the 4 ohm test, playing a 40 hertz test tone into some resistors. We're going to crank it up until the distortion light on the DD1 Plus turns on, and we get 332 watts RMS at 1% total harmonic distortion, just a smidge above the amplifier's rated power. Now we're going to crank it all the way up until the clip light on the AMM1 turns on in order to find out power at clipping. And for that, we get 334 watts. So pretty much dead on with the power ratings from the manual of 320 watts. Now, before we try the 2 ohm test, I want to show you something here in the manual. The manual says that it's rated for 360 watts at 2 ohms, and that seems a little bit weird to me. Typically, when you test these amplifiers, you expect to get an extra 50% every time you cut the resistance in half. Now, in a theoretically perfect world, you would double the power when you cut the resistance in half, but the world's not theoretically perfect, which is why we test these things out. I'm actually looking for it to give me something closer to 500 watts. I'm not sure about that 360 number. Must be a typo or something. So let's go ahead and crank it up and see what we do get. $529 watts at 1% total harmonic distortion, which is right in line of where we should expect this amplifier to perform. So I'm pretty happy this amplifier is doing what it should be doing. And then I ran into a problem. I cranked it all the way up and the AMM1 never showed clipping. I tinkered with it a little bit off camera, and I've reached the conclusion that the problems in my test setup, I'm just using an old cell phone as a source unit, and that is not really the best source unit. The output voltage from the cell phone really isn't very high. But in spite of the fact that I couldn't push this thing all the way to clipping, I was still able to get 557 watts out of the amplifier into a 2 ohm load. No doubt it could probably do more. The problem is 100% on my end here, which is why I always ask for your support on Patreon. The only reason why I'm able to afford this test equipment is because of the generosity of viewers like you. And with continued viewer support, I will eventually be able to afford the best possible test equipment so that I can continue to test these amplifiers out and show you which ones make their power and which ones don't. And as always, I want to say an additional thank you to my $25 patrons, Dylan, Bo, Baba, Bam Bam, David T, and Stereolab LLC. Now let's see if this thing can make its numbers at 1 ohm. And we are getting 831 watts at 1% THD, easily surpassing the ratings in the manual. Once again, I wasn't able to drive it up to clipping, but we still got 878 watts out of this 700 watt amplifier. I always like to calculate a price per watt so you can get an idea what kind of value you're looking at. So if you buy this from NVX.com and use the discount code DIYaudio15, you're going to end up paying about 110 bucks, and at that price, you're looking at 12.6 cents per watt. Now, in spite of the limitations of my test gear, that's still a pretty solid value. So NVX has an entire lineup of these XAD amplifiers, and Hi-Fi Vega tested one of them over on his channel, and just like this amp right here, it had no problem exceeding its rated power. I'll make sure to give you a link to Hi-Fi Vega's video down in my video description. So let's do a couple of more tests to get a better idea of the real world performance. We're gonna hook this thing up to a subwoofer. This is supposed to be a dual 2 ohm subwoofer, so it should be a 1 ohm load. But after box rise, some people call it impedance rise, we're not gonna get 1 ohm at our 40 hertz test tone. We're gonna get something closer to 3.5. So we shouldn't expect the same power output. The other concern is this thing called power factor. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And hey, I'm about to play a 40 hertz test tone at full tilt through this subwoofer, and subwoofers don't really like that. So I'm about to do some real serious abuse of the equipment. Do as I say, not as I do. Now, I really should have put the AMM1 in what they call dyno mode. That's a peak hold mode. So it'll measure the power and it will display the largest number that it sees. Right now, I've got it in real-time power mode. And what I'll do is I'll just hit pause whenever it hits the biggest number I happen to see on the screen. And that number is 831, which is what we got on the test bench at a 1 ohm load. So in spite of the box rise and the power factor, we still make our power. But you don't play test tones, you play music. Let's see how it does on music. And once again, it's perfectly normal for an amplifier to do less than rated power when it's actually playing on music. One thing I want to point out to you while the test is running is that you can see the distortion light on the DD1 lighting up. This is not distortion. The way the DD1 works is it looks for a 40 hertz tone, and then it looks for a higher frequency harmonic. And when that higher frequency harmonic passes some threshold, the light turns on. Well, when you're playing music, there's music playing at that higher order harmonic. So the fact that 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 light is turning on doesn't mean that we're distorted or clipping or anything like that. So it's in real-time power mode. Again, I should have put it in dyno mode. So I'm just gonna hit pause on the video when it hits the biggest number that I saw flash up on the display, and we see that we get 666 watts. And that's not a negative on the amplifier. You're never gonna get the same number on actual music that you're gonna get on a set of resistors. No matter what amp I set up in this test, it's gonna perform the exact same way. To learn more about how that works, click this video right here. To learn how to set your infrasonic filter, click this video right here. And don't forget to use the code DIYaudio15 when you shop at NVX.com. And if you'll click this subscribe button right here, I will see you on the next adventure.